Alright, chapter 3 begins on page 489, and it talks about the build-up towards war. Hitler's been preparing for a very long time. France and Britain have, and this is an American perspective, I'll admit, have to some degree kept their head in the sand. As far as they're really not prepared for war, they're not wanting to prepare for war. If we could just appease Hitler, then he will calm down. He won't require any more land, and this problem will go away. Well, the truth of the matter is Hitler was not going to calm down, and he was not going to go away. And so as the war breaks out, France and England particularly are not prepared for war at all. So what happens? Well, we are neutral. We're not involved in it. So we end up basically funding as well as providing a great deal of war material to these countries. When the invasion of Poland began, this is where the two countries, France and Britain, are forced essentially into war. There had been a pact, a secret pact between between the Soviet Union and I'll get it out in a minute, between the Soviet Union and the Germans. Sorry about that. This pact is partially secretive, and the secret part of this pact is going to essentially lay out a plan for invasion of Poland. The idea here is that Stalin, who is now in power in the Soviet Union, doesn't trust Hitler. Hitler does not like communists. There's no secret here, but these two basically enter into this pact. Stalin does it. It's so surprising to me. What I know about Stalin, it seems as if this is very uncharacteristic of him, except for that I truly believe he felt like this is the only way to stop a Nazi invasion. So he enters into this pact, probably knowing better, knowing that Hitler would go behind his back, and that's exactly what ends up happening. The idea is we're going to split Poland, the Soviets and the Nazis, and the Soviets are going to be able to retake Finland, and the Germans would look away. This all begins happening, and this invasion of Poland is going to be one that basically rocks Europe. It moves it moves the British and the French into a point of we have to go to war. We promised the Czechs that we would help them, and we didn't. Now with the Poles, we have no choice. We should have backed up the other countries, and now we're going to have to do it. And so they move into war. And those that are going to provide for the war are the Americans. We go into wartime production for these other countries. As far as Roosevelt was concerned, the idea of Britain and France falling was unthinkable. And there's several reasons for it, but not the least of which is geographical. If these two countries fall, what will keep the Nazis away from us? Yes, there's a big ocean, but Hitler is this guy that seems to be unstoppable at this point. And so Roosevelt wanted to prop these two countries up, and we began selling goods, war goods, to these countries on something called a cash and carry basis. We're not doing credit at this point. The idea is we're going to give you what you need. You pay us, we'll give it to you, no questions asked. The problem is that this money does run out pretty soon. And we see the war spreading quite a bit. The Soviets are able to take the Finland land that they were wanting pretty quickly. They had control by March 12th, 1940. And at this point, the Nazis have mobilized into Denmark as well as Norway. And these countries are falling. Talk about dominoes, they fall pretty quickly. With that, on May 10th, we see the launching of Fall Glebe, or Operation Yellow. This is where we see the Blitzkrieg idea come back out again. This is a terminology or a tactic that's used militaristically. It's this fast, lightning war. There's nothing slow. They move very fast. They get the land that they're wanting to conquer very fast, usually very violent, burn, kill, whatever it takes. We're just going to keep moving. And they do that. Your book tells you they get through Luxembourg, Belgium, and the Netherlands within just a few weeks. What that means is they are essentially knocking on France's door. It's just a matter of time now. And the French go into a panic. The army in France is large. It's 5 million men. But they're untrained. They are not ready for war. This was never a plan. And so when the Germans invade in mid-May, they fall apart. My mind goes back to the dominoes, and they just fall. They just fall and the Germans just walk right in. The British try to support them and help them, but the only way to help at this point is for them to get some of those higher ranking officials out of France, and so they secretly kind of skirt them out of the country as best they can because the Germans are moving in to kill. There's a picture, and I want to call it a great picture, but I don't want you to misunderstand me. There's a picture on page 492 of Hitler walking through Paris, and you've got the Eiffel Tower in the background. This is a man who's winning. He is winning every single line of this. At this point, we see Neville Chamberlain resigning as Prime Minister in Great Britain and Winston Churchill taking the reins. With this, we see a chain of events taking off. It's not that that change in power does it, it's just this is where things really are moving pretty fast. June 10th, Mussolini steps into war. He takes the reins and declares war on France and Great Britain, and so now we are fully at war. The occupation of France by the Germans is full and complete on May 22nd as they've signed an armistice, basically a peace agreement. The French can't fight them, and so they basically, for those that could, have gone over to Britain to prepare for the next stage. In the meantime, Roosevelt, while we're not ready to go to war, has gone to Congress and asked to expand the Army and the Navy, get some money for that, is able to really move us forward in that. And although we're not at war yet, he even gets Congress to approve a conscription bill that's going to enlist and train 1.2 million troops. In this, we see a change in direction with the Nazis. They've got France, they've got all these other countries, and so now they are going to launch Operation Sea Lion. This is going to be his attack, Nazi attack on Great Britain. It does fail. There's a number of reasons for that, not the least of which is they can't quite do a ground invasion before they do an air invasion. They do an air invasion, they've got to fly across the English Channel, they're low on fuel by the time they get there, and this means that they are not able to do as much damage, and so the British all but wait them out. Although I will say there are some incredible stories of the British Expeditionary Force. Their Air Force really goes into incredible efforts to shut down the Nazi invasion. And so you ought to read a little bit about that. Back in America, we're going through normal things. Roosevelt's up for re-election again against Wendell Willkie, who you need to know for your test. He is known for his honesty and integrity, but he doesn't have much political experience. He certainly doesn't have experience with what's going on in the world at large. So you have him running against Roosevelt, who won pretty soundly. They kind of use the political slogan, better a third term than a third-rater. They'll say anything, right? So in the time period that we are dealing with that, Roosevelt is going to have to deal with what's our next step. Roosevelt's promising we're going to stay out of war as best we can, but the reality is that's not going to happen very long. When we are moving further into the war, we also see Roosevelt expanding our trade with these other countries, with Britain and France particularly. Well, at this point, Britain. We are now engaged in something called the Lend-Lease program, which you need to know for your test. He's basically saying, I know you don't have money for these war goods, so we are going to lend you the war materials, and you are going to lease us Air Force and naval bases around the world. Britain had quite the cachet of those, and so the Americans are able to take in some of that. When we do that, the British are continued to be taken care of as best we could. Of course, this angers the Nazis and certainly does not better our end of that deal. In Chapter 4, this is where you get into Pearl Harbor, and we see the war fully move into America. Now, the only attack on American soil is Pearl Harbor, but that being said, it's amazing what this one attack does to us as far as bringing us into war. By this point, you have the Tripartite Pact of Japan, Germany, and Italy. You need to know that for your test. You also need to know that that relationship between the United States and China, and by proxy Japan, is shaky. Chiang Kai-shek is the military head as well as basically the king of China. He's not a great leader, but he is going to help the Americans as best he can. We have basically gotten into bed with this guy in a way that we can't seem to move on from. And this causes us a great deal of problem with Japan. Another name you'll want to know is Yamamoto, who is the Japanese admiral of the Japanese naval fleet. We see him being the mastermind behind the attack on Pearl Harbor. There had been initially a call for an attack on the Philippines to draw out the American forces, but Yamamoto saw the opportunity at Pearl Harbor and orchestrated that event. As we see that unfolding, make sure to read that material as far as how that happens, the events that are carrying on during that time period, and you see eventually that attack. 4:58, the Americans become fully aware, or excuse me, 7:58 a.m., the Americans become fully engaged and aware that they are being attacked, and the Americans go on the offensive, defensive, because we cannot catch up with what they've done. The first wave of those Japanese planes, 200 in all, are basically trying to sink our battleships, and they do quite a good job of it. During that first wave, you see the Arizona, which you need to know for the test. It's attacked. There's 5 direct hits. It's eventually hit in a location where fire erupts. It detonated 16,000 pounds of highly combustible black powder, and that basically splits in two. It rises up out of the water with the explosion. It splits in two and falls in. Today, some of the most haunting pictures I can see are those aerial shots where you look down and you see the Arizona below you. It's really quite remarkable. That's on my bucket list to one day see that myself. At this point, this attack, it should have been several waves of attacks. The Japanese end up calling off after the first very successful wave. The idea here is that the Japanese have awoken that sleeping giant that they call us, and they recognize that we are now going to come full force at them. The gray box discusses Roosevelt's interest in that war. It gives you an excerpt from his speech where he is basically calling on Congress to declare war. In Chapter 5, it goes through our end of preparation for war. Now, while we have been building up our troops, we've been building up our Navy, we've been building up our supplies and our war materials, that does not mean we are initially ready to go to war. We have to end up going to war on 2 fronts. There had long since been a promise made to the British that we would attack in England, in Europe, because there was such a fear on our end that if Britain fell, then we were the next domino. And the idea of this is a priority. That decision was made at the Atlantic Charter. Now, on the other side of it is Americans are saying, it's the Japanese that attacked us. These are the people we're mad at. Why do we not attack them first? So we go to war on 2 fronts to try and deal with that problem. On the Japanese front, you see General MacArthur coming to power. He is a well-seasoned army man who knows his business, and he's the guy that famously says, I shall return, as he is hastily removed from the Philippines and moved to Australia. His service is so important, he cannot be left there to die with his men. What we see happening in the Pacific theater, which is what they call it, is something we call island hopping, where the Americans are trying to take over each little island in the Pacific that the Japanese are now basically holding hostage. Now, there's a lot of things I talk about in this material as far as in class. The only thing I want to make sure and point out to you is the Japanese have been there in a way that the people that are on these islands that Americans are invading and trying to move closer and closer to Japan, the Japanese have informed these people, you do not want to be captured by Americans. They are savages. They will rape your wives. They will kidnap your children and murder them. They will have no mercy. And so so these islanders are often killing themselves in mass to protect themselves. If they cannot kill us, they're going to kill themselves. And so it's a very, very bloody and scary mode of action. In this time, we also see our efforts on the European front. Make sure to read about that. Part of that, we see that we have to deal with how are we going to get into Europe, and we do some of that through Africa. The idea, if you can mentally place Africa down here, we go in through Africa, attack a lot of Nazi holdings, Nazi and Italian holdings here, and we'll deal with them, kind of slow them down. Rommel is down there. He's a Nazi powerhouse for sure. Then we're going to come up through Sicily and Italy and then move on into Europe. Sorry, that was my map. Not very good, but there you go. As we move into Africa and then later into Sicily and Italy, we see massive death all around us. This is some of our battlegrounds where we see how good we are, and we also see how much war has changed. Do make sure to read that chapter very thoroughly. In Chapter 6, you see a little bit about what we're doing on the home front, the propaganda that we use here to get Americans on board with it. Again, we have moved into full-on War Protection Board efforts. We are seeing that we are now no longer in a depression because we are preparing for war. Our factories are focused, and Americans are not buying frivolous things. We're not just going and picking up a bag of chips at the local convenience store. Not that that was going on anyway. But you get the idea. These people are focused on war. They're focused on providing for and protecting the men that are overseas and fighting for us. And so we see quite a bit of effort. You see some of the posters there on page 511, as well as the use of WACS. That's the Army's Women's Auxiliary Army Corps. The Navy used the WAVES, Women Accepted for Volunteer Emergency Service. So this certainly changes what the American woman looks like during this time period. You also see, since we are so far into war production mode, that we need someone to come in and deal with our vineyards and our farms. And so we employ something called the Presario program, where Hispanic laborers come in and they basically work the fields for us so the rest of the Americans can focus on the war effort at large. Probably one of our greatest black eyes in American history is our time period where we move Japanese Americans into internment camps. Essentially, this is a concentration camp program where we are trying to protect ourselves from the possible threat of Japanese movement. Now, ironically, the German Americans are not targeted. The Italian Americans aren't targeted, except for probably on more local basis. You'd hear about some of that from time to time. But in mass, on a federal level, Japanese Americans are targeted and moved into these camps. This is to protect the rest of America, and in some ways they even use the excuse of it's to protect the Japanese as well. Unfortunately, this is probably really an embarrassing portion of our history. This is going to go into effect based on a call to action by the American government. It's signed off on by Roosevelt, and it's a decision called the Executive Order 9981. In Chapter 7, it goes through very quickly what happens in the war. Do make sure to read this. I want you to feel comfortable with that material. I'm going to point out a couple of terms that maybe you're familiar with or maybe not. Do know that during this time period you have another election, or excuse me, another election. Roosevelt runs against Dewey, who ends up losing, and then eventually this is what brings Truman on the scene. Roosevelt changes vice presidents every time. Truman is his last VP. Truman is, in so many ways, Roosevelt doesn't know it, but he is going to be the perfect man for that job, because when Roosevelt suddenly dies in office, somebody has to take that job. Your book talks a little bit about the German advance and then the Allies trying to cut them off. How we deal with that as we're moving across. You see a number of different battles that are important. Certainly the Battle of the Bulge is going to be one you'll want to notice on page 521, as well as some of the battles that go into that. Some of the most bloody and nasty battles are in this chapter. Do make sure and notice as well that this is where the Americans become aware of the excuse me, of the Holocaust. Now, had we known about the Holocaust before that? Yes, but what did we know about it? What extent did we know about it? The rallying cry within those that knew about the Holocaust, as far as government and military, was that we need to end the Nazi aggression, because otherwise what do we do? Do we bomb the camps and kill everybody in it? What's the benefit of that? So there were a lot of issues there. There's still a lot of critics that the Americans did not do what they should have done. I don't know that I really have a good feeling of how that would have helped if we had bombed the camps. Is there something else that we could have done? Maybe, but I tell my seated classes often, these are situations where I'm so glad that I wasn't the guy that had to make that decision. When you talk about the atomic bomb, there's still indecision about was that the right thing to do, and Americans still argue about it. In my head, I'm thinking it happened, and for the good and the bad of it, I'm glad I wasn't the guy that had to make that decision, because there was a lot that went into both of those decisions that are certainly very difficult. Do make sure to know about Iwo Jima on page 523, famously illustrated for us by the iconic photo on that page of the raising of the flag. Again, this is a part of that island jumping, trying to get to those people that are being, we're trying to get to Japan, and so we have to go through each island. Also know about the Japanese zealots, or the kamikazes, who basically do anything they can to stop the American advance through flying their planes right into people, places, things. Finally, what we see that's going to end our advancement in the Japanese theater, the Pacific theater, is the Enola Gay, which is the plane that dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. You want to know both of those things, Enola Gay as well as Hiroshima, and then you also know the second place on August 9th is Nagasaki. Make sure to read about this material as the atomic bomb was developed by the Manhattan Project. Such a cool bit of information. Robert Oppenheimer in his work on the bomb. What we do know about the bomb, and I don't know that it's mentioned here in the book, is that eventually when we come to the point of an end, it's time for the bomb to be dropped and they do the test. There are a number of scientists who basically go, oh, this is too much. We shouldn't have done this. And so there's a lot of ethics that come into play here before it's even dropped. Again, this is another issue that Americans still struggle with today. Keep in mind, this material is not meant to be all-inclusive, so make sure you read your book. You're going to want to have all that material as you get ready for your next quiz. Have a great day, and I'll talk to you soon.